What is the best build? Well, in single player, you take admin ideas and diplomatic ideas and go do a world conquest. In multiplayer, it's sometimes a case of it depends, but honestly, most of the time, you just go grab quality eco-offensive, and that's it. With that said though, variety is the spice of life, so today I want to sacrifice build goodness just to go over 5 unique and more, dare I say, fun builds that I haven't seen anyone talk about. This does mean that I won't be including unconventional, but I still believe known and strong builds, so for example, artillery versus 4th level modifier stacking builds, where you siege everything in like 1 or 2 ticks. Furthermore, as always, I'm going to start with the most tame and most easy kind of build, and progress towards the more insane builds as the video gets going. And while I will say that I don't think they get inherently more difficult, I mean some of the campaign starts can get a bit difficult, so they're certainly not trivial challenges later on, but today I don't think any kind of specific start or specific build is that difficult. Outside of maybe some optional challenges I'll mention along the way, but they're certainly not required at any point. With that rather large disclaimer section aside, before we do begin, just a quick bit to say that a like would be appreciated if you haven't already, and a subscription would be amazing, but with that all said, let's get into the video with the most tame. Special units are cool. Here we are in Poland, they have access to the Wind Hussars, and that's a rather famous build, because Wind Hussars are really strong. However, special units aren't just things like Wind Hussars, they also apply to Cossack regiments, which again Poland also has access to from the Cossack estate if they ever do take a steppe province, since they are in the Eastern Teg group. Or, for example, Swedish Carolingian infantry, which is an excellent infantry for sure. Or even Rajputs. Those guys are neat. But today I want to talk about a pretty well-known, but still I think almost under-talked about aspect of the Ottomans. See, the Ottomans are a strong nation, there's no denying that, but a large part of that strength actually lies within their Janissary infantry, which has some pretty nice bonuses right off the bat with -10 fire and shock damage received, as well as some fort assault ability. Bonuses you can build upon with your Janissary estate, for example, giving you infantry combat ability based on their crown land ownership, and even things like professional soldiers, giving reinforced cost, regiment drill loss, and who could forget an extra 2.5 discipline from ensured discipline training. And while the Ottomans are certainly very good at blobbing, and I would certainly suggest you do your blobbing in this campaign as the Ottomans, what we're specifically looking for today is a quality court build. Taking quality as the Ottomans already gives you quite a lot of extra military bonuses, making you that much more invincible. However, with quality court you're able to access the policy Special Forces Act, which is going to give you plus 10% special unit force limit. So to be clear, right at the moment we can take 17 Janissary infantry. But with our policy, we can get that up to 19. Now, our base Janissary counts depends on our heathen provinces. And while we certainly do own a lot of Sunni land, if you want to take this to the next step, what I'd actually suggest doing is getting a bunch of either Orthodox or Coptic provinces and using them to spawn religious rebels that will run around your land and convert it towards Orthodoxy or Coptic, meaning that you'll be able to get Janissaries from them. And as part of your conquest, make sure you do expand towards Persia, just in general a good idea to conquer, and then go into northern India, as this build is quote-unquote complete, with this fort here giving you, if you've guessed it, another 10 special unit force limit. It also lets you stack quite a lot of advisor cost, as this fort has no requirements, meaning that you'll always be able to run the -20% advisor cost, as well as the Parthenon, which you should have access to. You pretty much start with it for -20% advisor cost, meaning that you'll have relatively cheap advisors on top. That's just a side thing though. But yeah, the Ottomans are certainly known for their blobbing capabilities. They are known for their ability to go conquer half the map, and even for a bit of a vassal swarm build. But I don't think Ottomans building around Janissaries is talked about enough. Now, if you are an experienced EU4 player and have played the game a lot, I don't think this is a unique enough campaign. You've probably played the Ottomans before, and if you haven't, but you consider yourself an experienced player, you're probably going to find it far too easy. And in that case, you're probably better off not even doing this build and just taking admin, diplomatic, and blobbing. You're always going to be better off than doing that. But if you're newer to the game and you want to have a bit of a power trip and just running around with really strong Janissaries crushing all resistance even harder than you normally would as the Ottomans, well, consider Quality Court Ottomans as a Janissary build giga opener for you. I really don't see the court quality policy utilized, like, anywhere, honestly. And I think it's a shame, because if you are building around special units, it's certainly an invalid option. And if you are also playing Poland or any other nation that uses special units, anything from the Rajputs to the Carolingians, as previously mentioned, or even towards Revolutionary France with the Revolutionary Guard, the Special Forces Act will also increase your special unit force limit. So it's certainly an underrated policy, but then again, court ideas do seem to sit in a pretty weird spot where they're either overrated, I find, or already underrated. Frankly, I think it's just fine. It's a fine idea group. But with that all said, we move on to our next build, and that's going to be I want to fort every single province build and be an absolute nuisance to ever invade. And what does this build involve? Well, I've tagged into Lithuania over here, as you can see, and the reason I've picked Lithuania is because Lithuania is a rather large country, but more importantly for our case, it's also a rather poor country, meaning normally can't afford to run forts everywhere. In fact, it probably can't even afford the starting forts it has, as it's spending 1/3 of its income on its forts. Now, you might think that you'd want something like Switzerland that has fort maintenance in their ideas, or even Bukhara that has minus 25% fort maintenance. I talked about them in a previous video. However, the nice thing is that we actually don't. Fort maintenance is already capped at minus 90%, and you can get there in 4 idea groups as any nation, because all you have to do is open defensive ideas for minus 10% fort maintenance and 25% fort defense, which means that your forts become even more miserable for everyone else to siege. After all, defensive is pretty mandatory for any, well, defensive build, and the garrison size, as well as attrition for enemies, are going to make your forts even more miserable again for everyone. However, we can combine defensive with innovative ideas for the policy, superior fortifications, giving you even more fort defense and fort maintenance reductions, and it has a very convenient +1 free policy, which we'll be combining with quantity ideas as innovative quantity, has another minus 25% fort maintenance and plus 15% fort garrison, which, when we grab our final idea group, infrastructure, you're going to gain access to a final minus 25% fort maintenance, which means you have minus 93% fort maintenance. Now the cap is minus 90, meaning that you can have up to 3% inflation while still paying the absolute minimum for forts. And Lithuania is a relatively interesting country for you to do this with, as well as frankly any nation that has a lot of provinces but not a lot of money, because this kind of build lends itself rather naturally to making a dev build, and Lithuania actually has some pretty nice land to dev, since while the north of your country is covered in woods and marshes, you do have access to some farmland and a decent chunk of grassland. Furthermore, being within the Eastern Tech Group, Lithuania has access to Cossack privileges which can give you extra dev costs on the steppe. Looking at you, Cossack exploration expeditions, which let you turn steppes into just -5 dev costs. This build can also be really funny if you do it as Ming, because Ming has debuffs if you have devastation, and having a fort in every single province means you don't have devastation. And if you think about it, it's just a natural expansion of the Great Wall of China. Bad puns aside, I think it can also be relatively effective within the Great American Plains, as province distances are absolutely miserable, and most AIs or even most players would probably not even bother invading you over there, but if they do, they're going to be in for an awful time. Now, North America tends to be a bit more invadable, especially in multiplayer and even in single player, than places like the Inca, but you can absolutely make your opponents regret it by having a fort in every single province, and you can most certainly afford it, when 5 forts are going to be setting you back a respectable 0.5 ducats a month. Just to be clear though, of course, countries like Switzerland are going to do even better with this build, because they already have fort maintenance inside of their ideas, or access to alternative sources of fort maintenance, so they can skip out on some ideas and policies. But my main point is that you can do this as literally anyone. And I don't think I need to tell you how annoying it is to go through 100 forts into 100 provinces. And if you can't make 50 ducats a month from 100 provinces, then I think we have bigger issues. But nevertheless, we will now move on to our next build, and that's going to be a build I've affectionately dubbed Mandatory Friendship with Monetary Benefits. And for this, we're here in Kanem Bornu. As always, you can technically do this as any other country, but I'm going to recommend Kanem Bornu for your campaign. First of all, it's a relatively underplayed region and underplayed area, and while Kanem Bornu isn't exactly flush with content with their missions, they do have unique ideas, and that's what we're here for, as Kanem Bornu begins with 25% income from vassals, as well as having the ICTA government reform, which has, of course, 33% income from vassals. You can see where this is going. See, as Kanem Bornu, we're going to go ahead and grab quality, followed by influence, which indeed has plus 25% income from vassals. And once we've finished quality influence, we can grab the Integrated Administration Act, which has another plus 25% income from vassals. At this point, we're running a pretty respectable 125% income from vassals, as we get an extra 5% from our legitimacy, and the base value is 10%. Now, where this build really comes together is when we grab mercenary ideas. See, mercenary quality already makes your infantry really good, as you have quite a lot of infantry combat ability, and hence gives you quite a strong army, supplemented of course with mercenaries. But Influence Mercenary has access to the policy Client State Act, which lets you create client states stupidly early. Meaning that not only can you go and vassalize and create a bunch of small subjects, we're also able to, well, let us consider this as 3 dev savannah in the middle of nowhere. We're making 0.12 ducats from it, and we're getting 0.764 from it. That's not great. Let's create a client state from it. This stuff doesn't really matter, but when we've done that and gone through all the localization and stuff for it, we can now see that this nation is making 0.55 ducats from taxation. After all, it is making 0.5 base income, of which is now paying us 0.68 ducats. Now, of course, this does take a diploration slot. If you want to actually make a vassal swarm build that's effective, in a way that would present a valid build for a world conquest or something, go play Austria and do an HRE revoke, or go play the Japanese shogun and don't form Japan, or even go play the Ottomans and use their islets. However, in this very specific case, we're able to grab, well, it says 5 diplorations here, but we'll be able to eventually get this up to 8. As strong duchies will give us access to another +2 diplorations, and we can also go ahead and grab diplomatic for another diploration, although that's up to you whether you want to do that. In essence, though, you'll be able to run around with 7 subjects, without any diplomatic power cost associated with that, and we will need a month to update that, just to remind you. This nation here is paying us 0.68 ducats with an income of 0.59. But what's that? We're also getting 3.25 force limit from a province that was previously given a 0.75 force limit. Nothing I can't complain about, but it's somehow going to get even better as we can go ahead and enable scutage. Now, scutage, I believe, is certainly up there as one of those forgotten EU4 features. It's up there with trade winds and the artillery level available versus fort policy on your merchants, right? No one knows about this stuff really or remembers it. But in our case, it's really funny, because in return for this nation never participating in any of our wars, they're going to be even more financially broke, as they're now dependent on paying us 1.07 ducats a month with an income of 0.71. These guys are going to be constantly, well, losing money and constantly broke. Which also lets us keep them really loyal because we're able to constantly pay off their debt and in essence maintain their dependence upon us. Now, is this a really strong build? No, not really. I mean, let's be honest, there are just better vassal builds out there. But as a, dare I say, challenge or more even a fun campaign, Canon Bornu, I did select due to the income from vassals as well as the extra government giving you 33% vassal income. And of course, these vassal interactions giving you manpower from subjects or money from subjects are also going to be very nice once you have a lot of subjects. But also the nation is named after 2 states. We are called Canon Bornu, and this is a state of Bornu, and this is a state of Canon. So you can do the ultimate Chad vassal play around Lake Chad, because you can have a campaign where you take just these 2 states, and the rest of the time only have vassals for your quote-unquote expansion and nation building. It's a pretty severe limitation. Well, let's see how strong of a nation you can build with it. Just to reiterate though, is this a super powerful vassal build? No, honestly not. You're using quite a few ideas for this build, and if you really want to play with vassals, again, just go play Austria and do an HRE revoke, or Japanese daimyo gaming. Those are both just stronger options. But I believe a vassal income build based upon Canon Bornu and the specific ability to tax more money out of a client state than they actually conceivably make a month, well, that's at least funny to me. But with that said, let's move on to our 4th build. For this build, we need to consider trade company investments. Trade companies are things you can set up in trade company regions. Basically, if your capital is within Western Europe, you're able to set up trade companies in Eastern Europe, the Levant, Northern Africa, in Persia, in the Tartary region, and so on and so forth. And if your capital is, for example, in India, you're able to trade company everything outside of India. So far, so good. A place where trade companies don't exist, though, is, of course, the New World, as they have that whole colonial nation mechanic going on instead. Trade companies are interesting because they require you to have rather large autonomy on the provinces themselves, as the trade company core is always a colonial core. I did use the console to colonize this province, so of course it gave me annoyingly Eu4 core, but nevertheless it works the same when a province is in a trade company, it uses territorial core autonomy. Now this autonomy of 90% of course reduces your tax modifier by 90%, your manpower and setters by 90%, you get much less force limit out of it, and of course the production efficiency is significantly reduced. But to make up for this, trade companies gain access to trade company investments, which combined with the fact that trade companies actually halve the effect of autonomy on production. So for example, this should be minus 90% trade value from production, however it's minus 45% because the effect of autonomy is halved when you are in a trade company on specifically production. Yes, that seems a bit complicated, but don't worry about it. What it basically means is, for these buildings to do anything in a normal game, they have to be really, really overpowered. This company depot, for example, gives you an extra 50% local production efficiency on the entire area, which in essence basically lets you build a workshop twice. You're also able to really buff your forts with 30% local defensiveness, gain an extra workshop yet again with 50% local production efficiency in the area, as well as 0.3 local goods produced, or 1.5 free dev clicks, gain 50% local tax as well as minus 15% dev cost, and of course a massive 100% local manpower and sailors investment, which sounds really good, but remember your base rate is reduced by 90%, so what this actually does is that your final 10% becomes from 10, well 20, so it's really not that good in practice. Regardless, this build is all about making these trade company investments really, really shine. And of course, when they do, this double production efficiency of 100% bonuses combining with workshops and extra free dev clicks, as well as all of this extra manpower and sailors for defensiveness and even tax. This is basically a double temple. Well, it's going to make us a lot of money. And in this global trade company world giga capitalism build, we are of course going to need to play as our good friend, the United States of America. See, America, when formed, has access to American ideas, which of course include Empire of Liberty, which is very good at effectively crushing people's liberties. I know, rather ironic, as it gives you monthly autonomy change as well as a pretty nice minimum autonomy in territories minus 10%. Again, the fact it's called Empire of Liberty and is good at crushing autonomy is rather funny. Nevertheless, with our capital in the New World, this does mean that we can trade company anything in the Old World. No, quite literally, you can do a world conquest and trade company literally everything. And while it's certainly possible to get minimum autonomy territories down by minus 90%, that involves quite a convoluted modified stacking run. I've done this before, to be clear, however, doing things like becoming Buddha and running the Hindu deity to save access to the imperial city of Hu, as well as, of course, the Haramandir Sahib, because minimum autonomy territories here requires you to be Dharmic, and a Hindu with Buddha deity is also Dharmic. You know, things like that. Let's be honest, most of us were not doing that, and by the time we are doing that, we've won the game anyway. No, as America, all we need to do to get very, very effective trade companies is grab expansion ideas for minus 10 minimum autonomy territories, finish your ideas so you actually have Empire of Liberty enabled, and of course get a full-strength economic hegemon as you roleplay as a rich person. Well, you won't be doing much roleplay, with your minimum autonomy in territories reduced down to an impressive 50%, these trade companies become ridiculously profitable, and even the manpower isn't bad. If you stay a republic, you can also grab minus 10 minimum autonomy in territories from bureaucratic apparatus, which certainly isn't something that would hurt you, and frankly I would recommend, but I don't think it's even strictly speaking necessary. So go ahead, play as America, trade company in the entire world, and roleplay as some very, shall we say, militaristic capitalists that you truly deserve to be. But what if you're not into making money? What if you want to have hordes of large armies and you don't actually want to pay them at all? Now, one approach to this could be land maintenance reduction stacking, which is certainly one of the builds of all time. What if we approach this through the domain of regiment cost? See, for our final build, we are yet again back in Lithuania. God, that one guy is going to be so happy. But don't worry, we're not playing Lithuania, we're going to release ourselves as Smolensk. Smolensk, I believe, is already well known as the funny cannon nation, and indeed artillery combatability, siege ability, as well as plus 10% land fire damage and some artillery shock pips, all combined to make it a rather funny and strong cannon nation. However, we're not actually here for those military bonuses. Well, we are here for military bonuses, but not those ones specifically. We're here to look at the Great Foundry, reducing our artillery cost by 20%. See, regiment cost, and more specifically each one of our 3 types of regiments, can be stacked to minus 80%, but it's additive stacking. So if you have minus 50% artillery cost and minus 50% regiment cost, you have minus 100% artillery cost, again capped at minus 80%. The base maintenance of your units is also, well, based on the cost of the unit themselves, meaning that these cannons with their cost of 30 are costing us 0.71 each month, while the infantry, which only costs 10 ducats, is costing us 0.24 ducats each month. This means if you're playing Smolensk, you grab Moscow to build the Moscow Kremlin up to the maximum level, which has minus 10% regiment cost, and as you are uniting Russia, you can also make your way over to Dalaskogan, a province in west-west Finland, which contains the Falun copper mine, which has minus 20% artillery cost. Which means by building both the Falun copper mine as well as the Moscow Kremlin to level 3, you're going to reduce your regiment costs globally by 10%, as well as your artillery cost specifically by 30%, minus 20 here and minus 10 here, which you can go ahead and combine with quantity ideas. I mean, it wouldn't be a Russia build if you don't grab quantity ideas, which have minus 10% regiment costs on their own, but of course you can also grab expansion ideas. Now, expansion ideas are going to be quite useful for you, as you will not have access to Siberian frontiers, so they would be actually nice for you to colonize into Siberia, as well as the minus 10 minute autonomy territories, boosting the effectiveness of any trade companies you set up in Siberia. However, we didn't take expansion for the expansion quantity policy. Don't get me wrong, the colonial garrison policy is a pretty good policy, giving you both global settlers and land force summit, letting you colonize faster and have more troops. However, we need to go ahead and grab defensive ideas, which, by the way, also has minus 5% land maintenance modifier, as well as minus 5% land maintenance modifier from quantity, giving you some extra maintenance reductions on top. And that regiment manpower usage is pretty good, don't get me wrong. Anyway, the defensive expansion idea policy, local army organization, is going to reduce the regiment cost by a further 10%. And finally, to tie this all together, go ahead and grab court ideas, as court ideas with quantity has the Plentiful Material Act, which reduces your infantry cost by 10%, but your artillery cost by minus 15%. This indeed would combine with the minus 20% artillery cost from the Great Foundry, and the aforementioned monuments, mean that our artillery cost is reduced by 25%. Of course, we can get a little bit more artillery costs if we do things like trading in iron, which I'm sure you'll be able to do in your game. However, it combines with our global minus 30% regiment cost to actually give us minus 85% artillery cost specifically, meaning you can run up to 5% inflation and still have the bare minimum pricing on artillery. This bare minimum pricing on artillery, of course, mean that while everyone else is out there paying 10 ducats per unit of infantry, you're paying 6 ducats per unit of cannons. It also only sets you back 0.14 ducats a month in maintenance, letting you run absolutely insane armies. And where this shines even more is, of course, this means that it's cheaper to go force mode because you just have such cheap troops, you can kind of ignore the mechanic a lot more. Your infantry is also significantly cheaper, although rather funnily, it costs exactly the same as your artillery. That's of course to say not a lot, but it's a rather funny turn of events. So yeah, Smolensk, the mass artillery and mass army build. This lets you run a very stupidly large army as Russia, which of course is what you're trying to do anyway as Russia, but more specifically in this case, this army is not going to make you broke because it's practically free. Is this the most effective Russia build or Russia campaign? Absolutely not, but if you want to do a Russia campaign that's not paying for its army, this is the build for you. And while Smolensk is usually utilized in the form of a artillery strong build, you can also utilize it here as an artillery everywhere build. Meanwhile, quantity ideas combined with your innate access to the Russian Principality, which later becomes the Russian Tsardom, mean that you shouldn't be struggling with manpower either. But there we go, I hope you found at least one of these builds interesting, but with that all said, that is all the time I have for you today. Thank you very much for watching, with a special thank you to all my channel members, especially Ark, Solar, W Haste, Lemon, Star72, Lord Zendikar, Nick Fassbender, Nanhatan, Nikas, The Awesome Rabbit, Bester Gaming, Granville Flavia, Sov, Mobkiller, Anthony35, AC Napa, Glorious Leader, Frankie, Yukata, Danray, Private Claw, Jack, Marvy, Conspiracy Pizza, and Lebarule.